You know, I challenged Skip. I said, just introduce me as Mrs. Ellen. She likes kittens named Snowflake. I dared him, and I really thought, when you said she only told me one thing, I really thought you were going to do it, Skip, but thank you very much. Thank you very much for that lovely introduction, and thank you all for being here. I am thrilled to be at the Clinton School. This is my first trip to Arkansas, so and thank you, June, for all that you did to help to arrange this. So what I'm going to do tonight is, besides the shameless plug for my book, which there are a few copies available at $40, is share with you some of the work that my co-author June and I have been doing, where this started, well, I won't go back as far as where it started, but the book looks at successful examples of dead big box, dead malls, dying commercial strips, aging garden apartment complexes, you know, Class B office parks, and other underperforming suburban property types that have been retrofitted into more sustainable places. And they're not the sexy, high design, really beautiful architecture headline projects that I'm an architect and I love to see, but they're a story of transformation and change that I think I became quite fascinated with, and I'm happy to share with you. So June and I find it useful to categorize the different kinds of ways people are dealing with these properties according to three basic strategies: re-inhabitation with more community-serving uses, redevelopment, which usually means scraping the buildings and building up, urbanizing them and into more mixed-use, compact communities. And then third, re-greening. Sometimes we never should have built them in the first place. The fact that they've gotten old and died is an opportunity to reconstruct the wetlands or create a park that will actually create more value that way. So I'll show you a number of the examples. I mean, the book goes into about 80 different examples, 5 that we really do detailed case studies on, and then now we're tracking over 200 projects around the country. And I'll just show you a few examples of each of the strategies. But before I do that, I want to sort of set the stage with both, you know, why is this important? Because a lot of times people, and rightfully so, say, why focus on retrofitting the suburbs? We should be revitalizing our downtowns and just put all our energy right there. And I say, absolutely. We should be, and frankly, we have been for a long time, and in the last decade, not all, but many of our downtowns showed improvements. You know, we were starting to see, I think, very, very positive things there. But there are also reasons to focus on the suburbs. And this is just a snapshot, a little bit of sort of where we are right now. Now, I know Little Rock is blessed to not have had, you know, is not going through the recession quite as badly as the places that were really booming. I live in Atlanta, and it is night and day between 2006, 7, and right now. But nationwide, about a third of our enclosed shopping malls are dead or dying. We haven't built a new enclosed mall since 2006. In this country, and we were building almost 20 a year in the late 90s. But there's a lot of them are aging and dying. We have over 300 million vacant square feet in big box stores, just all over the place. Vacancy rates in strip malls are 11% nationwide, highest it's ever been since anyone started counting. And a lot of this has to do with just the sheer quantity of retail square footage in the US. On a per capita basis, we have almost twice as much as the next country in the world, Canada. So we have 23 square feet per person in shopping centers. Every one of us. We could go clean it. And so because of this, a lot of retail experts do believe that we are just vastly over-retailed. And these dead spaces, they're not coming back as retail. There will still be retail. It's a very volatile field, and it's often fairly short-lived. But plenty of dead retail properties do get re-inhabited with another retailer comes in. But still, overall, a lot of the experts do feel it's a correction. This is a major correction, and we just have this vast territory. And what do we do with it? So that's one reason to start, thinking about retrofitting the suburbs. It's this, you can get depressed about it, or you can say, opportunity. Look at these things. They're not our most loved landscape. Now we get the chance to do it right. We get a do-over. So a couple other quick reasons why one might think about this. Sorry, that image is not, we're not getting the best contrast on there, but that's San Francisco and Oakland across the bay from each other there. Anyway, from the perspective of climate change, if one wants to really get serious about watching our carbon, on average, urban dwellers have about 1/3 the carbon footprint of suburban dwellers. There's lots of caveats in there, but now this is the test for the audience. Why would you guess that that would be so? Why would suburbanites have bigger carbon footprints on average? Cars, driving, absolutely. That's number one. What's the number two reason? Detached buildings. Basically, you're getting more exposed surface to leak energy out of per individual person. If people live more compactly and you share a party wall or share a floor, you don't have to use nearly as much energy. So on a perspective of when you look at it on a per capita basis, the cities are actually already green. It's the suburbs where we start to see the danger, the reds, the yellows, the oranges. And the sheer quantity means that if we want to get serious about climate change, frankly, it's the suburbs that really are the much bigger target where we can actually make much more of a difference. Now, dependence on foreign oil, another reason to be obviously, sort of concerned about this. Transportation, all that driving, transportation uses 69% of the oil is going into transportation. And our vehicle miles traveled has doubled in the last 20 years and at 5 times the rate of population growth. I mean, because of our development patterns, we've just been kind of sprawling out, driving more and more. This is now, the Joint Chiefs of Staff consider this a national security issue. That we really have, and it's also even a jobs issue. We're putting all that money into our gas tanks instead of kind of what the opportunity cost, what we could be spending. Now, a reason to look at the suburbs that isn't quite as well understood or recognized is from the public health perspective. Most of us think of the suburbs as the healthy place to raise your family. We've sort of received that message for the last 100 years. But actually, the Centers for Disease Control, with a lot of other researchers, have increasingly been correlating sedentary lifestyles with suburban patterns of neighborhoods without sidewalks, people with long commutes, just sitting, much less physical activity. And so we've actually seen a correlation between human sprawl or obesity and suburban sprawl. In the same places where you have the most sprawl, you tend to get, so really alarming rates of increases in obesity over the same time period when we've really been spreading out as a country. This has incredible impacts on cardiovascular disease, diabetes. 1 in 3 children born today is likely to get diabetes in their lifetime. And, add to that, Dr. Dick Jackson, who used to be a director of the Center for Environmental Health at the CDC, likes to shock audiences by saying, heaven forbid, but if your child was to die in a pool of blood, is it more likely to happen in the center of the city or in the suburbs? Now, most of us grew up watching TV cop shows and movies, and the image that comes to mind of a child in a pool of blood is it's probably in the city. Now, 13 times more likely to die in a car crash in the suburbs. Car crashes are the #1 cause of death for anyone under age 24. And the most dangerous roads tend to be the furthest out, where they're very wide roads, and especially if there are, sadly, drunken teenagers on the road. This is just a chart showing sort of the correlation between traffic death rates in the most sprawled cities and the least sprawled, or the most sort of new urbanist smart growth cities. So again, suburbia is not as healthy as we think it is. Now, another reason that sort of surprises people when we think of the suburbs as affluent, but in fact, and they are, many of them are, but since 2005, more Americans in poverty are living in suburbia than are living in cities. Cities still tend to have higher rates of poverty, but the actual sheer numbers, and they've been taking off. In the recession now, most of the growth in poverty has actually been happening with foreclosures and happening in the suburbs where people have far fewer social resources to draw upon, far fewer social services. They have to have a car to be able to get around. That already is an enormous expense. So all of that sort of then leads to, finally, the big reason to think about retrofitting the suburbs is affordability and how it hits all of us in the pocketbook. And the reality is, suburbia has provided generations, especially of Americans, with the opportunity to live the American dream. And most of the time, those starter homes have been on the cheap land furthest out. That the assumption is always the land is cheaper the further out you go. And that, so you'll get more house for your dollar the further out you go. But the savings associated with that cheaper house are more than eaten up by the additional costs in transportation. When you get, it sort of varies on income level, varies on the price of gas, but more or less at about 10, 12 miles is where those two lines cross. And it's interesting because our system has really been a system of providing affordable housing by drive till you qualify. That's always been the model. Well, we've kind of seen drive till you qualify really collapse with the highest foreclosure rates being out at the furthest edges. But it's just, let alone the relation to the subprime mortgage issues, it's also really an issue of transportation costs. If I asked every one of you, what % of your income do you spend on housing? You could tell me. It's fairly easy calculation. If I asked you, what % of your income do you spend on transportation? It's harder. There's so many variables between assuming that if you do own a car, insure the car, garage the car, park the car, fuel the car, maintain the car, let alone whatever other forms of transportation you use. Very few of us do the math. It turns out that on average, average US household spends about 19% of its income on transportation. But that varies wildly depending on, if you're wealthy, until you start flying Lear jets, you kind of there's only so much of your income you can spend on transportation. If you're in the lower half of all American households, you're actually spending more like 30% on average of going to transportation, and none of us do the math. If you live in a walkable neighborhood, you might be getting it down to 12%. But if you live in a drivable suburban neighborhood, guaranteed you're at least up at 25%. Now, there's a really interesting website where you can actually look up all over the US and find out what the percent of income going to housing and transportation. It's called the Housing plus Transportation Affordability Index. So I looked up Little Rock, and so this just shows us, how much more expensive. On the left is the monthly transportation expenses in 2000 versus those in 2008. And guess what? It's gotten more expensive. Guess what? It's cheaper when you live close and more expensive when you live far away. This website lets you query things there's a whole lot of variables you can put in. So here I also asked it to show average block size, because a block size is a great proxy for walkability. If you have a fine-grained network of streets, small blocks, it's really easy to walk wherever you want to go without getting out of your way too much. If you have really large blocks, chances are it's not very walkable at all. So, and then compare that to CO2 emissions per household, and you see a very clear correlation. The more walkable, the more compact and connected the grid is, the less CO2 emissions, the more people have to drive, the less walkable it is, the more CO2 emissions. Now, that affordability doesn't only impact the individual household's budget, it also impacts the municipality. Because having to lay out all that infrastructure, roads, sewers, power, for low density means you're paying for it. You've got only, maybe 10 houses on a street versus in town, more compact, you might have multi-story, so you've got a lot more folks paying for the same increment of infrastructure. And it turns out that the differences can be about 20 to 40% higher for municipalities, that the more you spread out, you've got a lot more infrastructure to pay for to maintain, and not as many homes. Chuck Marone, a guy who studies a lot of this stuff at the Urban Land Institute, has actually argued that since the 80s, we really stopped paying for all of that infrastructure in a sort of orderly way. And he argues that essentially it's really become, suburbia's kind of been based on something of a Ponzi scheme, because you build, for each development you build, if it's low density, that road in 25 years is going to have to be repaved. If you've only got 10 houses on it, even if you put all the taxes from those 10 houses into a bucket for all 25 years, you wouldn't be anywhere near enough to pay for the repaving. And so the only way communities pay for it is, well, they have another subdivision go in, get the impact fees from that, pay for this one, but it's just this constantly kind of escalating scheme. And we've seen it come to a close, and we've seen just, municipal budgets completely flatline. So, okay, lots of reasons to rethink suburbia's unintended consequences. There's lots of great things about suburbia, but as I've shown, there are these real challenges that, as we started building the post-war suburbs really in earnest, sort of 50s and 60s, and we're starting to really see some of those consequences. So it's important to, I think, to start to redevelop the suburbs. It's not going to be easy, but luckily there actually are some very strong trends in our favor. And most importantly, I think it's a pretty remarkable demographic shift. We all think of suburbia as family focused, but that's not who actually lives there. Since 2000, 2/3 of suburban households have not had kids in them. The 2010 census is looking like we're not yet at the 3/4 point, but we're up to 70% of suburban households do not have kids in them. And basically, the reason is the baby boomers, who were the babies that the post-war suburbs were built for, are still there. But they're empty nesters now. The baby boomers don't tend to have kids. They don't have kids in their homes with them anymore, but they're still in the suburbs, about 75% of them. So you've got a generation that have aged with the suburbs, and they're still there without them. Then you get, and it just so happens, the way the generations kind of work, we've got a lot of boomers. Below them, in the middle there, is Gen X. Gen X are the sort of in their 30s and 40s. They're having kids, but they're a small generation. There aren't enough Gen Xers to fill the existing single-family homes that the baby boomers will vacate. And in fact, if you could assume that we were just marbles on a table and everyone could just roll to fill every existing vacant house, we have enough single-family home stock to last us at least through 2035. We have a glut of single-family homes. We don't need to build any more for a while. And yet, all of our zoning codes are mostly mandate that most of what they're looking for are single-family homes. Most of our fellow citizens who are willing to serve on neighborhood planning boards and planning councils, and I absolutely appreciate everything they're doing, but most of them feel very motivated to protect their neighborhood. And in their minds, that means that whatever grows in there should just be more of the same, only single-family homes. That's all, yes, we want to grow, we might want to grow a little bit, but we only want single-family homes. It's this image that is still based on a lot of those folks who moved into the neighborhood in the 60s and 70s when 40% of households, when the majority of households did have kids in them, as opposed to the reality of now. So, but what's really interesting is when you start to ask, the two big target markets are the boomers, and then after Gen X is the millennials, or Gen Y. They've just hit 30, but most of them are still in their 20s, upper teens. And Gen Y is, again, a huge market. Like the boomers, I mean, these are the two target markets, and I'm a boomer, and the boomers, we're going to have to get used to, as more and more of us do get into retirement, we're going to start spending less. We lose target market status. But those Gen Ys, they're just getting into their careers, they're spending money, they are the target market. So everybody wants to know, what do these two target markets want? Well, so, do yesterday's suburbs meet tomorrow's seniors' needs? And it's interesting that the consumer research on both groups says the same thing. Neither of them want to become their parents. Meet the yippies, youthful, energetic, elderly people into everything. The boomers are not going to retire quietly. They invented youth culture, and they fully expect that they want to be engaged and volunteering in activities, walking everywhere, taking transit once the kids take the keys. They want to be completely engaged and involved. But they live in the suburbs and they want to age in place, which in many cases will mean that some will be able to live in their homes, but for a lot of people it means they're looking for a more urban lifestyle that's safe within their existing suburban community. They want to stay in their same town with all their friends, but yeah, they really don't want to mow the lawn anymore. Then it's interesting to ask, okay, what about the young professionals, the Gen Ys? They do not want to be Dilbert. They do not want to be the office park dad and mom. They grew up being shuttled around everywhere. And even those young professionals, those Gen Y folks who grew up in the exact same neighborhood that their parents grew up in, their parents had free range. Their parents in the summer would get on a bike and say, see you, Mom, and be back at dinner time. But not the kids who are in their 20s now. They might have grown up in the exact same suburb, but most of them were shuttled everywhere in a car. The fear of abductions, they were never allowed to be just free-ranging. And they really don't want to become the chauffeur, and they don't want that for their kids. Some polls showed 77% say they want to live in an urban core. Pretty remarkable numbers. Now, they're idealistic 22-year-olds, so even if only half of them, by the time they hit 30, are still thinking that way, that's actually a huge shift in the patterns. Sadly, I do think, though, they want urban core, but the reality is their jobs are more likely to be in the suburbs. Suburban job growth has outpaced urban job growth by a factor of about 6. Be interesting to see how the recession plays that out. Obviously, there's not much job growth at all right now, not nearly enough. But what I think we are seeing, though, is this is a convergence of the young professionals looking for an urban lifestyle, but their jobs are in suburbia, so in suburban places. And they're looking for some nightlife. They're looking for some networking. They're looking for things that suburbia hasn't really been providing, those urban things. Now, one of the other big factors that I think is driving suburbia is interesting because it's really just a question of time. When we built the first ring of post-war suburbs in the 50s, they all loved being a suburb. Downtown was at their back. They were on the edge, and with fields out one side, the city behind them, loved their mall, loved their subdivision. And then a new mall opened up 5 years later and 5 miles further out. And then their mall kind of lost some of the fancy shops. And then, this keeps going. And we've seen over and over that those earlier, older suburbs and the older malls start dying. And the wealth, the money just keeps going further and further out. Well, it's been happening for so long now that what's really interesting is that same process that took away a lot of the desirability of those inner suburbs has also given them a relatively central location in their now expanded metro. So even though their mindset is often still, we're a suburb, we're not downtown. Downtown's over there. But they're not at the edge anymore, they're actually at the center. And if they choose, they can decide to make themselves more of an urban destination, take advantage of that centrality. And many, many of them are. Especially if they're in cities that have transit systems. And so we've seen in DC tremendous expansion of the transit network out into the suburbs, triggering an enormous number of retrofits. This slide is already out of date. I need to add like 4 more dots just in the last 2 years. Now, the last factor, sort of dynamic factor that's been driving a lot of these changes in the suburbs is the sheer proliferation of what developers like to call underperforming asphalt. And I like to think of it as the name of my indie rock band in a parallel universe. I think it really rocks. But basically it refers to underused parking lots, and we have lots of them. This slide is from Atlanta, where I live. This is Perimeter Center. Now just the name, the oxymoron, says it all. Perimeter Center, it's changing, it's shifting, you know, nobody knows quite what the identity of these places are. Now if you happen to know perimeter, it's, anyone who knows it would say, it's totally built out. You can't do anything there. That slide is about 80% surface parking lots. If you start thinking of those parking lots as potential building sites, there's tremendous potential. And that's exactly what's happening. So that now, increasingly, the owners of these properties are saying, I'll build a parking. Now that this is a relatively central location, now it does make sense. It makes sense to build a deck and build up on the rest of the parking lots. It didn't make sense when we first built it, but it does now. So, all right, what do you do with dead big box, dying malls? Well, it turns out lots and lots of things. It seems like, you know, every week I come across a new, like, whoa, never thought of that one, kind of idea that people are coming up with. I'm just going to show a couple of them here. So this is in Hercules, California, a developer who bought the rights to redevelop a park and ride. But the economy's not so good, so he's going to wait it out and just sort of temporarily create a town center rather than actually investing in the bricks and mortar. So on the surface of the parking lot, he's not actually breaking ground. He's just putting up an open air market shed, bringing in food trucks, and then he's got retail in the trailers, the Airstreams. You know, he's creating a little town center on top of a parking lot to seed the community, to just, you know, take this parking lot, and now it's become a gathering place. And it's really, and it only took him 1 month to get the permits. So, you know, it's not permanent. It'll be there for a couple of years. He actually plans to move it. Once he starts developing that site, then he'll move this stuff to another site, and he can keep moving it around. But he's re-inhabiting the parking lot. This is another very modest example. This was a little Food Lion grocery store that has been adaptively reused into a public library. They didn't, you know, fundamentally change the infrastructure, although they did take out a few parking spaces, put in a bioswale to capture the run and clean the runoff. Very handsome job, I think, on the building. But most importantly is they made a public space in the midst of what was otherwise mostly private commercial space. Suddenly now there's a public gathering place. And I'm really going to be curious to see if over time, what else begins to, you know, happen around this site. Never underestimate the power of good food to make a place into a destination. There are loads of examples. This particular one is in Phoenix, 2 little L-shaped strip malls, and all the owners did was get some bright paint and good food. The post office became Il Postino, a very nice restaurant, a little gourmet grocery store, a bar, a taco place. The real estate ads now all proclaim walking distance to La Grande Orange. It's become a huge selling point for the whole neighborhood because it became what sociologists like to refer to as a third place. If home is the first place and work is the second place, The third place is where you go to hang out, build community, chat, meet. And suburbia it's been so focused on the social life revolving around the single-family home and the school that it really, suburbia has not built, it's had a dearth of third places. But now that the demographics have changed, now that there are actually more 1- and 2-person households in suburbia than families with kids, there's tremendous desire for places, whether you actually talk to anybody, doesn't matter. You just want to be kind of in proximity to other people. One of the big trends in some of these re-inhabitations is also meds and eds, medical centers and educational facilities. Lots and lots of malls and big boxes, shopping centers that have been vacant have been turned into various kinds of medical clinics, bringing the medical services out to the aging boomers, basically, and education from charter schools all the way up. This particular example in Nashville combines them both. The second floor of what was a sort of struggling mall has been completely taken over by the University of Vanderbilt's Medical Center. So now you can, while you're shopping, you can suddenly go, oh gosh, I need that eye exam. And then while you're waiting for the results, I want to go check out the sales. But some interesting combinations. And this is the last of the re-inhabitation slides, but I really like this one. This is a dying mall in St. Louis that half the mall is still a mall, but the other half they've turned into art space. So they've got artists taking over each of the individual inline shops, and then dance troupes and theater groups taking over some of the bigger spaces. Now, it's not bringing in the tax revenue that the retail did, but it's better than having the lights off, and it's keeping the mall alive, bringing in a new clientele, and providing a great resource for the artists. Jane Jacobs, the sort of famous urban theorist, wrote in the 60s of the importance of cheap space for a complete community. You've got to have space for the nonprofits, the low profits, the music teacher, not just the person selling instruments. And a lot of suburbs, I mean, if it's only new construction, inherently, there's not going to be any cheap space. You want to have some of these older buildings shifting into new uses, allowing for some of that really more entrepreneurial, mom and pop businesses, incubator and creative nonprofits and all that sort of stuff. So the re-inhabitations tend to, I think, be a great way to help build up social sustainability. However, if you're really trying to build up the environmental sustainability and a lot of the economics, then you're more likely trying to look into the redevelopment scenarios. So there aren't many, residential subdivisions are pretty static. Once property has been subdivided into multiple owners, you don't see a lot of shifts. Although we actually were surprised. We found more examples of entire subdivisions being retrofitted than we expected. In this case, this is just right at the end of one of the transit lines in DC, and the developer went around, knocked on people's doors, offered them double the assessed value. Everyone willingly sold. They bought up 69 houses, and then after a fight, they received permission for a 30-fold increase in density because it's right at the transit stop. And so now there will be about an 8 to 10 story town center with office space, retail, right at the transit stop, some senior housing on the side, and then the rest of it is mostly condos and apartments. It's a dramatic change, but again, right there at transit, especially in the DC area, there's so much demand for this. And closer to home here in Fayetteville, a residential example I wanted to show. Now, the holy grail of retrofitting is connecting the cul-de-sacs, you know, especially when you see them just this close and it's just like one lot apart and I want to connect those streets to increase the walkability, increase the connectivity of the networks, all that stuff. But haven't yet found, there occasionally you get a bike path going through, but I have not yet found, if you know of any, please let me know, connecting up the cul-de-sacs. But this one might happen. This is a proposal in Fayetteville. Here's 3 cul-de-sacs, and then they end in a lot right next to a street. And there's a proposal now, they're trying to get a HUD grant to build senior housing that in little cottage courts. And it's really interesting, using, so that would connect up to the cul-de-sacs and then connect back to the street. And it's also, what's nice in this one is the houses are using an Ozark house type, which is the bent house, but they're making them into duplexes so that one of the houses will face the street and the other will face the shared open space, the cottage court, because they're really trying to get eyes on the open spaces and to improve security for the seniors. And so it's an interesting sort of residential retrofit in terms of at least trying to connect up those cul-de-sacs. But by far, most of the retrofits have been on retail sites. Some of them very modest. This was an A&P grocery store in Montgomery, Alabama, that has now been redeveloped into the A&P lofts. It's 8 little buildings with retail at the ground floor, and they sort of wrap a courtyard, and then 2-story lofts kind of above them. And this one is the oldest of the strip mall, of the oldest retrofit actually that we could find, from 1988. This was a little family-owned strip mall. You can see the black and white photo from the 60s. And then the map. In 1985, it just sort of sat there, 3 little buildings on a big wedge. I know you can't really see in the light very well, but a big sort of wedge-shaped site at a traffic circle. Over 20 years, the owners simply built on top of the parking lots, just bit by bit, and created a little New England village with apartments above the retail. Added a post office, a church, a couple of other uses, but just sort of very gradually. Now they have permission over the next 20 years to connect that town center to more compact residential neighborhoods that will connect it up and through. And it's a really great example, just building on the parking lots slowly and over time, and really very successfully. This is another example of building on top of the parking lots, but this time in an office park. This one is also outside of Washington, D.C. These are 10-story office buildings designed by Edward Durrell Stone, the noted architect of the Kennedy Center, Museum of Modern Art. I think has some ties here. And so, and actually was initially planned, he wanted it to be a mixed-use project. He had planned to have sort of a podium and have a tower of housing, but the housing never happened. But when a Metro transit stop coming out of DC opened up kitty corner to the site, the owner said, well, gee, these surface parking lots don't make sense anymore. So he decided to insert a new main street in between the existing office buildings, leave the office buildings exactly as they are, functioning as they are, build a parking deck, add a lot more housing, cinemaplex, a bunch of things. And it's pretty neat. So the site, it was a farm in 1940 in the little village of Hyattsville. By 1980, they'd put in a highway. You can see the 3 rectangles of the office buildings, and then there's a mall next to it and some garden apartments kind of above and around the mall. And then this was the projection when we went to press. You can see that the transit station had come in. That's the tracks that are sort of coming through below the site. And then you see the existing, the gray, are the 3 rectangles, the office buildings, and then all this new stuff just being built right on top of the parking lots. And then we had to update the plan this summer because since the office park was retrofitted, now the owner of the mall is thinking about extending the same street grid through his property. Meanwhile, the property just to the north of the mall, has those garden apartments have already been now permitted to be torn down, and they were 3-story. Now they're going to be 8 to 30. They've got two 30-story buildings. And then 2 more parcels there, C and D, are also in play at getting rezoned. So in this case, the arrival of the transit was the trigger that kind of triggered one property to change, the other. But the whole area is going from being extremely auto-dependent, all just boxes surrounded by surface parking, to now becoming this really much more urban, kind of funky place. Here's what it looks like. You see that the white are those existing, the office buildings are still there, and then a new funky condo building, and then public space. Now the new Main Street, you can see there below, is sort of inserted in front of the office building. Now urbanistically, I love what it's doing. Architecturally, talk about a lost opportunity. It's sort of like they picked the most suburban version of, a strip mall version of a Main Street that they could, which is really, really unfortunate. But they got the urbanism right. The buildings will come and go. They'll get it right the next time, hopefully. There's some very affordable housing in the not so pretty high rise, but it is super affordable. And then that's the rendering of the next one that's coming in. So what's also interesting is, so here's the same site, that cluster of dots on WalkScore. How many of you are familiar with WalkScore? WalkScore is a website that you can enter your address, any address, and it will analyze, basically using Google Maps, how many uses you can walk to from that location. And it just and it's on a score of 1 to 100. And then Zillow, which is a very well-known real estate investment firm, they do a lot of analysis. In 2009, Zillow started looking at walk scores, and they found that for each point, so from 78 to 79, for every point up you go in walk score, the value of residential property would gain between $700 and $3,000, depending on the market. So the addition of what was just an office park that now also has the most agglomeration of eateries in the whole county. It's got a cinema. It's got all these other things. Even though that just happened on that one property, it increased the property values of everything within at least the half-mile around it, and to some degree within a mile. There are some of the Wall Street real estate investment trusts are beginning to look at walk score and say, all right, we're only going to invest in areas that have a high walk score. There are communities that are now saying we want to write policy that encourages higher walk scores. So it's interesting to look at this stuff. By the way, actually I'll go back to the walk score. I looked at the walk score for the Clinton School. Very good. Right here, we're at about an 82, I think. But Arkansas, Little Rock as a whole, only a 40. Arkansas as a state, the top 25 cities, only a 32. Very, very bad. Low walk score. Lots of room for improvement. Now, the category of retrofits that are sort of the glamour type, the one that gets all the attention because they're so visible, are the dead malls. When a mall dies, everybody sees it, everybody knows it, the whole community's morale kind of drops down, and everybody wants to see something done. This is the oldest mall retrofit is this one. It was the Boca Raton Mall in Boca Raton, Florida. The mall only lasted 15 years. Most malls have a lifespan of more like 25 to 30. That's why we built a lot in the 70s. They're starting to go. The land essentially defaulted to the city. The city set up a redevelopment authority. And the city said, all right, if we're in control for the moment, we want 2/3 of this property to become public space as it's redeveloped. So the design sent other communities have sort of, at that moment, have said, we want to see affordable housing. Or but there's when it defaults, the cities have an opportunity to actually, say what they want. In this case, they wanted public space. So the design centers on a linear park, which is then flanked by retail with offices and apartments above. When it was first done in 1998, whoops, the 8 fell off there, this was seen as crazy. Americans don't live above the store anymore. Well, it sold out immediately. Then it's gone through 8 additional increments of people adding was more and more luxury housing. It is routinely referred to now as Boca's downtown. And part of it is because also the retailers, they know their market. We have, so where teenagers are the #1 group who shop at malls. But in the suburbs, seeing the shift of demographics, less teenagers and a lot more young professionals and empty nesters, they realized, okay, we're going to provide sit-down restaurants instead of a food court. We're going to provide nightlife, places for young professionals to meet each other. And it's been a very, very popular place now for over 20 years. What it's also done is it increased its taxable value. It's now the 2nd largest provider of taxes to the city of Boca Raton. So it went from being a dead mall, a total liability, to now becoming this really very successful project. Now, it doesn't connect particularly well. You're looking at the backs of the parking garages on the side with the highway. The other side, they lined the parking garages with townhouses to face the residential. It's better. But, it's not, we've learned more. I think there are better ways to still do dead malls since this one. But it got a lot of communities that suddenly had a dead mall saying, we want to do what Meisner Park just did, what Boca did with Meisner Park. But looking at the taxes is an interesting issue. Most suburban communities really feel they live and die by the sales tax base. They feel they need that big box. They need that mall in order to bring in sales tax. But most of that sales tax actually goes back to the state. They only get to keep a portion of it. Property tax, they generally get to keep all of it. And if you begin to look at property tax on a per acre basis, it gets really interesting. Because suddenly then that big sprawled out retail shopping center or big box with a big parking lot isn't actually all that profitable. And so now as we're aging and a lot of our communities are getting more and more built out, and land is really what a community has, and you start to look at your land, you begin to realize that, gee, the minute you get the slightest bit of mixed use and a little bit of height on those buildings, you start to see the tax yield shoot up. And whereas the payback on the infrastructure for a mall is about 75 years, and it only has a 25-year lifespan, the payback on that 14-story mixed-use condo downtown, that's the tax revenue. But the payback on the infrastructure to service that, if it's in a connected street grid, you've just got to do a little water main, the roads are right there, about 3/4 of 1 year. So, just the differences as we start to look at these things, and look at them in slightly different ways, it becomes very interesting. Now, my favorite of the dead malls is this one, Belmar. It's in Lakewood, Colorado, about 4.5 miles outside of Denver. It went from being a very large dead mall, 1.2 million square foot regional mall, on a 100-acre superblock, just surrounded by parking, a couple out parcels. It is now 22 walkable blocks on tree-lined streets. It all LEED green construction on the buildings. They have a few surface parking lots, but they put wind turbines up on the light poles, so they're using the parking lots as wind farms, lots of photovoltaics. Just, this is a really, they have a museum, they have quite a bit of public space. It's really, and a real mix of housing types. They don't have as much at the really affordable end. That's my one critique. But, so here it is in its heyday. It was the Villa Italia Mall, probably the day after Thanksgiving. This was Lakewood's downtown. They had their prom at the mall. They loved their mall. Here it is in 1975. By 1995, the mall has died. They kept the department stores, because department stores in general, we found this true in numerous cases, they're multi-story, better construction, easy to renovate. The single-story stuff, yes, there's a lot of embodied energy in there, but the mechanical systems are shot after, they're so out of date after 20, 30 years. The one-story stuff, environmentally, you're getting a lot more out of just tearing it down and starting over and building up. So here's the build-out plan for 2015. They're about 3/4 of the way done. They went on hold in 2008, or 2009, I think is when they stopped. They've just started back up again, but really a great, it doesn't look all cookie cutter. It doesn't look, you can't quite tell, what's new, what's old. I think it's really quite a remarkable project. Well, so here's what the sort of heart of the project looks like. This is not high-rise urbanism. It's the downtown for a small suburban town. But even though it had to stop in the recession, between 2002 and 2008, it's already generated over $200 million for the city of Lakewood. 9 acres of public space and parks, 8 bus lines that come right through the new downtown. It's really, I think, quite a great project. Now, this map shows Belmar in its context. It's the red star with Denver in the middle. And the other dots are the 13 enclosed malls in the Denver region. 8 of the 13 have retrofitted or announced plans to retrofit. They saw what Belmar did. They saw what, all of them. Now, they haven't all retrofitted in quite the same way as Belmar, but it's really quite remarkable. Basically, the public sector in Denver has figured out how to get the building department to talk to the planning department, to talk to the public works department, to talk to the emergency fire and safety folks and parks and rec, and get all of them to coordinate their regulations and to agree, yes, it's okay to do skinny streets, yes, it's okay to do mixed use, yes, it's okay to go vertical, all this sort of stuff. At the same time, the private sector has figured out how to negotiate these complex public-private deals, how to work with lenders who often are very skittish about mixed use. But it's quite remarkable. So whereas in DC, it really transit was the driver, in Denver, the dead malls. What's also, I think, really useful about looking at this plan, the map, really, is to recognize that not a single-family house was bulldozed. This was simply bulldozing underperforming retail properties. No one was displaced. No one was denied the choice of a regular single-family home neighborhood. All of those are absolutely still intact. All it did was provide a choice now for the people who actually want to live in a more urban lifestyle and want to be able to walk to a mix of uses and parks and things. But it does mean that we end up with then essentially pockets of walkability. And if we really want to be serious about systemic impacts of sustainability, the question is, how do we connect all the dots? And to do that, we need to start retrofitting the corridors in between them. So this is an example, the first example in the US of converting a commercial strip corridor into a boulevard. And the advantage of the boulevard, so this was, their main street was also a state highway. But when state DOT had to widen the highway, it killed their main street. So their main street just sort of became a strip. Then when DOT came back and said, oh, sorry, we need to widen it again, the little town of Cathedral City said, no, we want our main street back. And in California, as in many states, if a community wants to take back ownership of a state road where it runs through their borders, they can have it. Just means they're now responsible for repaving and all that. So they took back ownership and they remade the street into a multi-way boulevard. So the through traffic, the fast traffic goes in the center, side aisles, lanes then for the transit and the parking for the new shops. And then most importantly, they put in all those trees. Now, the AASHTO traffic engineer design guidelines that are still, that's what you read and you pick up, it's the same book, it's been for about 50 years, refer to trees as fixed hazardous objects and sidewalks as vehicle recovery zones. It's still an issue. Legally, the engineers are unfortunately still bound to a lot of that, have been until now, and that's another slide. But the trees, they make it much safer for the pedestrians, and they make it grand. They make it elegant. They make it a proud address. I mean, no one in their right mind would choose to live along the commercial strip of the black and white images, or any of our commercial strips. But you can imagine grand apartment buildings or grand homes along a boulevard lined with those trees. They built their city hall, they built a park, they're slowly attracting more development now. But Orange County did a study 10 years ago which identified that they had over 800 partially vacant strip malls. And they said, if we could redevelop half of them with just 2 stories of residential, we would meet the county's housing needs for the next 35 years without having to tear down another tree. Atlanta, where I live, has been, through the 90s and the first half of the 2000s, Atlanta was tearing down 53 acres of trees a day. Just chopping them down at the edges for new subdivisions, mostly for subdivisions. If we began to retrofit more of our commercial corridors into places where people would want to live, service them with transit, that's the more now of the affordable, make it affordable because it's serviced with transit, make them grand and lovely places for that growing demographic group that are looking for more urban places to live. We could be planting trees instead of tearing them down and fixing that is the solution that is out there to the drive till you qualify. Drive till you qualify is broken. We have to redo our corridors. And meanwhile, we've got corridors that are filled with all this retail that's empty, that just isn't, or if it's not empty now, it will be soon. Other interesting ways that people are rethinking some of the corridors and right-of-ways. In Washington, D.C., this is an example of an intersection very near a subway stop. But the intersection has these really wide turning radii. It's completely designed for cars and very hard for people to cross the street. When you make the turning radii that wide, the pedestrian, you can't get across the street in the time that of a light change. So the city said, all right, we're going to make that back into a 90-degree crossing that's easier for pedestrians to cross, and recover all that right-of-way, those traffic islands, That's publicly owned land. We're going to give it to the developers if they'll build pedestrian-friendly, compact housing right near a transit station. And that project is under construction right now. And part of what has sort of, allowed that is the production of, on the lower left there, a new manual called the Institute of Transportation Engineers, Designing Walkable Urban Thoroughfares, a context-sensitive approach. The Congress for the New Urbanism, an organization I happen to be on the board of, has worked with ITE for 7 years to come up with this, which finally, for the first time since the AASHTO Green Book from the 50s, that now, establishes a recommended practice of engineering standards for streets and corridors in urban places that respects pedestrians, bikes, as not just designed around the car. And it's now a recommended practice. We're trying to get every state in the country to adopt it, which is purely a symbolic gesture, but it's just not yet very well known by many of the traffic engineers, that a lot of them get it. They know they want to do more walkable stuff, but the legal pressure on them, they can't change from precedent or they'll be subject to a lawsuit. They'll subject their city to a lawsuit. Not anymore. This is now a recommended practice from ITE, and FHWA's bought in, so it's really a pretty significant change. Other tools that we're seeing more and more, there's now about 50 corridor projects in the country that I know of. There may be even more. Lots and lots of work in this area. This is a great one in Northern Virginia. It's a 5-mile corridor that has just, commercial strip. It was a historic road, but it had degenerated pretty badly. So it now, they made 4 nodes at the major intersections and targeted those for redevelopment. And so they wrote a form-based code. Most of our zoning codes are use-based. They just tell you what uses you can put there. A form-based code says the uses will come and go. I don't care what the uses are, but the form of the buildings that's what cities are made of. And that's what will give us a space of a street that gives you a sense of place. So the form-based code allows up to 8-story buildings right up at the corridor, but then they have to taper down to 2 or 3 as they meet the residential neighborhoods, sometimes in just a 1-block distance. And they deliberately did not rezone in between the nodes because that's where a lot of the affordable apartment buildings are, and they wanted to preserve the affordable housing. But what's really cool about this project is that the additional density from along the corridor will go towards supporting a streetcar. So we've seen plenty of cases where transit is then driving densification. This is now the opposite. The densification driving the transit, and especially as we have less and less money, for transit systems, to start new transit systems, this is a really interesting model. And even in this lousy economy, this one is moving ahead. In fact, it's been so popular that now the neighborhoods have asked that the form-based code continue along the cross streets. So they've invited them to come back, do more. We like this. This is great. The Canadians, however, are really ratcheting up the corridors. In addition to coordinating land use and transportation, they're now also employing district energy, which is really cool. As you go from single use to mixed use, you start to get both daytime uses and nighttime uses, the residential and the office parks. And so a district system lets you balance off those loads. District system basically just like a university campus generally doesn't have, each building doesn't have its own heating and cooling. You have a campus-wide system. Lower Manhattan, or everything is all Con Edison is a district's heating for the whole It's not a new technology, but the sharing of energy between buildings allows for great efficiencies. So as new buildings are coming along, the code now says that the big buildings basically have to oversize slightly, but then they're allowed to sell their energy, and the smaller buildings don't have to. And it's really pretty cool. They're also getting some, I think, pretty remarkable mixed uses in it. They already put in a subway on the street for the Olympics and upzoned at the stations. So we're seeing a couple of their new mixed-use buildings. That's a Home Depot that is topped by affordable housing and then lined with boutique retail along the edges. This one is a Whole Foods tucked in with office up above and no surface parking lot, which they usually require. Now, on the transportation and technology side, as we plan ahead, I love these, and I had to throw these in. We do have to try to anticipate the new technologies, because who knows what kind of corridors we're going to need with the Schweeb, the straddle bus, and the bamboo bike. The Schweeb up top is an inverted human-powered bicycle monorail. And they won $1 million from Google for their idea of using that to connect like buildings and office parks that are just too far away to walk. The straddle bus is also pretty amazing. This is actually being built in China. The straddle bus is a 2-layer bus, but it's hollow on the lower level. It drives above 2 lanes of traffic. So it's like bus rapid transit, but without giving up the dedicated lane. So, and they're really building that thing. So pretty amazing new technology. And then the bamboo bike is amazing. I've actually seen this. It's you grow the bamboo into the shape of the bike frame. Just as the bamboo's growing, you just keep sort of sliding it along a guide. And so we can start growing our own bicycles. There's no end to the kind of stuff we can do. I'm going to skip that. All right, but all that densification won't work everywhere. And sometimes it really just makes more sense to re-green these properties. There's an avid suburban farming movement and lots of urban agriculture. I love this one. In Cleveland, the manager of a mall looked up at the skylight in the atrium and said, that could be a greenhouse. And so they're growing in raised beds. They're growing organic veggies inside the mall. While the mall's open, they're re-theming their food court to be all healthy food and just completely reimagining space. And then there's the rather very controversial but intriguing concept. Detroit is talking about shrinking its service boundaries and doing industrial scale agriculture on the rest of the land that the sort of former edges. This is an example of a strip mall outside of St. Paul that was built on top of a wetlands. That actually, before the Clean Water Act, that was fairly common. And you just drain it, put in a culvert. Well, the strip mall was as the strip mall was dying, the culverts had failed, and you can see in the middle image there the water perking up in the parking lot. So it happened to be on a major migratory bird route, so the city was convinced to reconstruct the wetland, and they built this beautiful lake, and really their intention was purely environmental. But in the process, they created lakefront property and attracted the first new private investment in over 40 years to a very low-income neighborhood. So it's interesting how, and in general, parks, lakes, green spaces improve property values. Dead buildings depress property values. So in a lot of cases, you get this double economic and environmental boost by regreening. This is an example of a mall outside of Seattle, an older mall, but that is doing very well. They wanted to expand, but the environmentalists, local environmentalists were still mad at them that they had culverted a major stream under their parking lot. And so they said, well, you can only, you know, they struck a deal that the mall would be allowed to expand if it gave up to, you know, almost half its parking lot, one side to a transit center and the other side to where they've now built a huge facility to capture the runoff of over 600 acres and clean it and reintroduce the stream. So there's some senior housing in the foreground and some mixed use on the other side, and it's a pretty remarkable facility. So that on the one hand, you know, what used to just be in a pipe underground, degrading the quality of the water. The more that water is exposed to sunlight and air, it's healthier for the water quality. But it was just adding zero value. Now it's an amenity. It's a park space, and it's, you know, it's not quite your. If you really wouldn't want to go down and try and drink that water, it's nasty. But it's still the idea that we can really use our green infrastructure to get as an amenity to increase property values is a great thing. Now, I'm about to close, but I want to just ask, you know, so what are these places really like, these retrofits? This was a dead mall plan that I went to the design charrette where they're really working out the design, and I know, I watched the architects, I mean, work really hard at trying to create a place that looked really authentic, that every tweak in that main street is oriented to a specific mountain view, the materials, everything is looking towards local means of making place in the Salt Lake region where this was. But it's still, you know, architects, a lot of us look at this and we sort of say, yeah, but it's instant urbanism. It's a faux downtown. It's kind of fake Disney. It's instant, you know. And we hold anything instant in disdain. And I'm first to admit, you know, I love cities that have evolved over time, that have the patina of multiple generations, where I feel connected to this larger course, and it's not just the self-gratification of just instant, you know, I'm me, and it's all sort of pre-chewed. This is a slide at downtown Silver Spring, which is a retrofit in Maryland, and of a protest taking place on the AstroTurf Town Green. Now, it doesn't get much more fake and phony than an AstroTurf Town Green. It actually turned out the skateboarders really loved, they came up with all sorts of new moves you could do on AstroTurf. The people in business suits could lie down at lunch, not get grass stains, moms and little kids. Actually, people really quite learned to love the AstroTurf. But it just, you know, part of me looks at this, and on the one hand, I was thrilled that, you know, the fact that a protest is taking place, that's democracy in action. That means they got the urbanism right. They made a public space. They took what was this sort of sprawling suburban place, and they set up a system of streets, blocks, and lots that actually created what was clearly a place to hold a protest. But, you know, the surfaces, the design, little thing, you know, kind of, you still can't, I can't help but wince at a lot of the design details. These are very hybrid places. They are public spaces, but generally under private management and ownership, so they're only sort of public in quotes. They have urban streetscapes, but they still have suburban parking ratios. They have urban qualities, but at suburban costs, which usually means cheaper and thinner and not quite well built. Local placemaking, but really with national retail design and funding. And, you know, often a lot of them do end up looking kind of cookie cutter. They have populations that are more diverse than typical suburbs, but less diverse than typical cities. And they are these examples of instant urbanism. But I flip it to all the architects in the room. We have to learn to do a better job of designing instant urbanism. We can build the incremental city that I think most of us love if we have a walkable infrastructure in place. If the walkable framework of interconnected streets is in place, then fine, you just infill a new building here and there, change a parcel over time, do all the incremental growth that we're used to. But if the infrastructure is basically suburban large blocks and swirling street patterns that are not walkable, just changing one parcel at a time doesn't accomplish much of anything. We have to, in order to really retrofit suburbia to be more sustainable, we have to do it in big chunks. Unless we can figure out how to do incremental infrastructure. I'm holding that one out as a hope, but I mean, generally, we have to figure out how to really, I think, do a better job of designing instant urbanism. And certainly, I want to see improvement in the architectural design of these projects. In general, I find them urbanistically great, and architecturally, not so great. Lots of room, but that's what the next generation can work on. The other thing that I really hope to see as we go forward is a lot more targeting of retrofitting at the metro scale. All of the projects I showed happened because someone was able to strike a deal. The stars aligned. You know, they managed to do something. But now, especially, the recession has just accelerated the proliferation of candidate sites. We can't retrofit them all. We should make very deliberate choices. And so there are tools that are out there and that can still be developed. Gray field audits map where all the underperforming properties are, and then choose which should be regreened because we shouldn't have built there in the first place. Which should be redeveloped because they've got the transit connections. They're in great opportunities for redevelopment. And where should we actually just focus on re-inhabitation because we need the cheap space and we want to encourage really affordable stuff. There's lots we can do still to remove obstacles and increase the incentives for retrofitting, and a lot of that is happening. Most of the projects that I've shown here, not a good portion, most of the projects in the book were developer driven because a developer saw the opportunity. Since the recession, it's completely flipped. The public sector is absolutely driving most of the projects now. That's why we've got a lot of corridors, lots of rezoning going on, lots of repositioning. But again, there's good stuff that's happening. The other really interesting thing that is happening now is, and it's a double-edged sword, but we have a lot of underemployed planners, architects, urban designers, landscape architects. And what a lot of them are actually doing, which is really great, is they're seeding retrofitting through pop-up cafes, food truck rodeos, and what is often sometimes referred to as tactical urbanism. So I'm going to just really, really quickly blow through a couple of slides. You know, improving the quality of the retrofits. We can do it, but so far it's mostly been in Canada and other places. This is actually a retrofit of where they added 5 floors on top of a mall, just extruded the atrium up. Bing Tom is a really great architect in Vancouver, did a great project. Design competitions have been, I think, elevating the design quality, but we haven't seen much of them built. But some interesting stuff, again, especially the Canadians. In Denmark, Bjarke Ingels of BIG, I think, you know, he's been thinking creatively, critically about kind of suburban ideas, but reimagining and completely reinventing them. So this is a housing project where each house has its own AstroTurf lawn, and they're stacked on top of a mountain of parking. So you drive up this swirl of parking so that you can drive, you essentially park right in front of your house. But it's collective. It's The Mountain as the name of the project. You know, but it's just I think, you know, I would love to see more of that kind of creative thinking happening in the States. What I see instead in the States, though, is fantastic thinking at the urban design scale, thinking about the planning. This is another book, the Sprawl Repair Manual, Galina Tacheva, really, I think, also making the point of how do we begin to selectively target sites for retrofitting. Grayfield audits, best example is the Long Island Index. You can go online. It maps, online maps of every single vacant property and or surface parking lot within a half mile of the over 180 train stations on Long Island. Long Island is thought of to be as built out. They found 8,300 vacant acres, the equivalent of Manhattan below 50th Street. And by then having a design competition to just get people thinking about this led to some really creative ideas and thinking. This happens to be one of how to extend from the train stations. You know, there's not, other than the train, which is great, there's not much other transit on Long Island, but there's school buses. And they're only used for a couple minutes, you know, a couple times a day. So using the school buses to expand the network of the transit. Or this one, really a radical vision of just thinking at that regional scale of saying, okay, we want to cluster all the development within walking distance of the train stations and farm it all. This one won the People's Choice. This was the open internet voting, and this was what actually most people selected, kind of wanted to see. Lots of great, again, the way that the public sector is incentivizing retrofitting. I think there's lots of great stuff. We need to do more, though, to be effective with all the incentives. If you're really serious, we also need the disincentives for continued sprawl, and that's what hasn't been happening very much. And then finally, sometimes, you know, you just can't get the market for the retrofitting. But if you have to build sprawl, there are techniques called anticipatory retrofitting. Lay out the parking lots as future building sites. So this is one of those other Denver dead mall retrofits, Englewood. It's got transit on the left side of the plan, and it does have a sort of you know, new urbanist, compact, mixed-use area over there, but then there's a Walmart and some other big boxes with big surface parking lots. But the trees are planted in what will be the future street. The utilities are in the street. You know, the Walmart lifespan is not likely to be all that long. Eventually, you know, it's allowing and anticipating a future build out. But sometimes it's just, you know, the way to really seed these things and get them started is with the kind of temporary pop-up stuff. This is an amazing project. Some very young folks got together. They're in Oak Cliff, which is outside of Dallas, and they targeted this uninhabited block, just a 1 block long with vacant storefronts. And they got a permit for a 2-day art installation where they temporarily revived the block. So they opened up all the storefronts, they made their displays just out of milk crates, they painted a bike lane on the street, they brought in just plastic light poles and trees on wheels. It was so popular. It blew people's minds that they put a lot of the community then just sort of demanded the city council, we have got to get this block going again. That was in last November. Every single storefront was occupied by March. I mean, pretty amazing, the power of this. They've since gone on, you can go online and download, they have instructions on how to build a better block, do it in your town. They've done Build a Better Boulevard, they've got Build a Better Big Box. Lots and lots of really fun. Many of these strategies have been gathered together by the next generation, who are the younger folks within New Urbanism, under the rubric of tactical urbanism. You know, and it includes everything from just painting a traffic island green and putting out some cafe chairs, as they've done in Brooklyn, to dumpster pools. Temporary, I mean, literally, those are dumpsters. You just put a plastic liner on there, and you can make it a pool for a day. Figuring out new ways to enliven public space that don't just rely on retail. So I'm going to close with that. The fun sort of images. There's so many ways to retrofit. I don't think there's any one right answer. Different markets, different places are going to use a variety of these strategies. But thank you very much.